Hello fellow Earthlings, it's Libs, and today it's time for me to share my favourite reads of 2022. I've got 10 favourites and 2 honourable mentions to get through, and I thought I would start with some of my yearly stats. I do love that whenever I film this video, I'm somewhere where there is no tripod or anything I can use as a tripod that's facing in a good direction for lighting, so we are getting this slightly odd angle, slightly strange background, but you get my fun little wine earrings again, so I guess that works. Okay, so the first book I read of 2022 was Middlesex by Jeffrey Eugenides, and the last book I read was Seeing Other People by Diana Reid. The genres I read the most were literary, historical, and contemporary. The longest book I read was Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead, and the shortest book I read was Howl and Other Poems by Allen Ginsberg. My most read author of the year was Rick Riordan. My average rating of the year was actually 4.11 stars. So I have had a particularly good book year. I think I've got 27 books I read this year were 5 stars. In July I read 20 books. The most popular book I read this year was The Song of Achilles, and the least popular book was the Australian Women's Weekly's Icons, The Women of Hollywood. I read 90 books by authors I hadn't read from before, and 22 books I read were part of a series. I only had 1 reread, and there were 9 books that I DNF'd this year. But let's crack into which books were my favourites. So the first honourable mention that I want to talk about is The Wolf Den by Elodie Harper. This is the first book in the Wolf Den trilogy. I read the first 2 books this year. This trilogy follows this young woman who is a slave in a brothel in Pompeii, and it's about her trying to escape from this life to get her freedom, and it's her manipulating the men around her. It's sad, but it's fun, but it's sad. It's really great so far. The 3rd book I think is coming out this year, which will be exciting, and I cannot wait to get my hands on it. And the second honourable mention I want to talk about is If I Had Your Face by Frances Cha. This is a Korean book that explores the beauty standards in Seoul, female friendship. It's just, it explores, I think it's 4 friends or acquaintances and their relationships with each other and the men in their lives, and what some of them feel they have to do to gain the approval of men. It's a fascinating read. I really enjoyed it, and I would highly recommend it. It has taken me a ridiculously long time to figure out the order I want to rank my top 10 books, but I think I have finally figured it out. So, in 10th place we have The Last Housewife by Ashley Winstead. I wasn't sure which of Ashley Winstead's books I wanted to put on this list, because I also read In My Dreams I Hold a Knife this year and I loved that, but I think this book had a little bit more of a punch to it, so I decided that was probably my favourite of the 2, but they're both awesome. This book I haven't really heard many people talking about. It's about a housewife who listens to a true crime podcast presented by this guy she used to be friends with, and she hears that there has been an alleged suicide of one of her old college friends, and that he thinks there's something else going on, that there have been a bunch of young women disappearing from this area, and that it's not being taken seriously. So she decides she wants to help him investigate, and it digs up a lot of things in her past. This book has quite a few trigger warnings, so definitely look those up before going into this book. It's very dark and twisted, and it's not really at all like her previous book. It is a lot darker, but if you think you might be interested, definitely look up the synopsis, look up the trigger warnings, and see if it's for you, because I really enjoyed this one. Book number 9 is the last book I read of 2022, and that was, of course, Seeing Other People by Diana Reid. I've seen a lot of people compare Diana Reid to Sally Rooney, and like, I kind of get it, but also I think we all tend to compare most literary fiction novels about young women to Sally Rooney. This is set in Australia, set in Sydney, I think, around Sydney. It's about two sisters and the kind of love square that occurs, happens, ensues. It's just a really interesting exploration of the family dynamic, coming to terms with sexuality, learning to communicate better. It's just a great one. It's a great summary read as well, and I really enjoyed it. Speaking of Sally Rooney, book number 8 was Normal People. So this is the first Sally Rooney book I have read. I have kind of been putting it off for a while, mainly just because there's so much hype surrounding Sally Rooney, and I was kind of nervous to read it. But as I am starting to learn, sometimes you just have to give the hype a go if you're even remotely interested in the concept of the hyped book. But I really enjoyed this. You probably don't need me to tell you what Normal People is about. You probably already know. But I did end up really enjoying this. I listened to the audiobook, and I think that was the way to go, just because I've heard a lot of people struggle to physically read her books sometimes. So I had a really great time with this one. And yeah, if you still haven't given Sally Rooney a go, I'd recommend trying, just to see if she's the kind of writer you might be into. Book 7 is definitely a surprise to me, and that is One Last Stop by Casey McQuinstead. I don't necessarily have the best track record with romance books, but this is more of a magical realism romance, and oh, this angle's not working for me. My arm is dying. I don't have the best track record with romance books, but this also has a magical realism, almost sci-fi element to it, and I ended up really, really enjoying it. I think I just need romance novels that have another large plot to them. It can't just be romance. So this is about a 20-something girl new to New York, and she meets this mysterious woman who's always on the same train, and it's about the relationship that blooms between them as our main girl realizes that this new love interest has kind of been stuck on this train since the 1970s and cannot get off, and is frozen in time. I love this. I love the friend groups. It was just such a warm and fuzzy, cozy read. I just had a blast with this one. Could not recommend it more. Book 6 is a poetry collection, and it is Redlow Fog by Melissa E. Jordan. I actually got this sent to me as a review, and I actually really loved this book. It's told through documentary transcripts. There's a mystery. All the different characters have different poetry styles for their transcripts, and I just really, really enjoyed it. and had such a fun time with it. I love that at the end it tells you what all the different styles of poetry are and how they work. And I just thought this was such a unique poetry collection, and I loved it. We are now in the top 5, and the 5th book was Girl 11 by Amy Suter Clark. This is about a true crime podcaster who is obsessed with trying to find the identity of this guy known as the Countdown Killer. He hasn't been active in a long time. It's a cold case, but she really wants to figure out who it was. So throughout the book, you've got her going through the evidence of all of his victims. And his thing was he murdered women from like the age of 20, and then the next victim was 19, 18, and it goes down. And now more girls have started disappearing again, and our main character thinks that the Countdown Killer might be striking again and is scared because her next door neighbor's daughter, who she's really close to, has just turned 11, and that's the next number in the countdown. And I just really enjoyed this one. I don't necessarily read a lot of mystery thrillers, but I thought this was a great one. Book 4 is The Poet by Louisa Reed. This, not exactly a novel, not exactly a poetry collection, but kind of both. It's about this young woman who's studying at Oxford. She is doing her PhD, I think, and is writing about this famous female poet who's kind of been forgotten about. She's in a relationship with a professor who thinks that her work is his work and steals her thesis. And it's about her trying to get revenge on this annoying man. And I loved it. I thought the poetry in this book was beautiful, and I just had a great time with it. Books 3 and 2 on this list are interesting ones. They're both books I initially gave 4.5 stars to, but I've been thinking about them pretty much non-stop since I read them, and when trying to narrow this list down, they ended up in the top 3 somehow. But I'm also not surprised because they are brilliant. So book 3 is Babel by R.F. Kuang. I don't think I have words for this book. This is a dark academia set at Oxford with a little bit of magic and just a lot of deconstructing colonialism and class and elitist institutions, and it was just brilliant. It's really, really powerful, and it's my first proper dark academia, and I'm really glad I started with this one because it really, I just don't think anything's going to beat it. I listened to the audiobook while I was on a university trip, which was an interesting choice, but I really enjoyed this one. It's such a powerful book. The writing was incredible. The characters were so well thought out, and the sad bits really hit me hard. My second favourite book of the year ended up being Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I loved this book when I read it, but I had one major problem with it, which is the grooming situation that's never really addressed. And everything apart from that I loved. Everything apart from that I loved. And I still feel weird recommending this book because of that, but just be aware that's an issue with this book. But I just loved it. It's about these two old people who were in a relationship when they were young, and he has never really ever given up on her and is determined that now in their old age, and now that she is a widow, that they will get together. And I loved how this was written. I loved the descriptions. It was just such a beautiful book in so many ways, except one. But what can I say? I haven't stopped thinking about this book since I read it. I read it pretty early on in 2022, so it has to be one of my favorites. And then we reach book number 1, my favorite book of the year, a book that if you know me in real life, you will not be surprised by this because I have not stopped talking about this book since I read it, and that is The Mountains Sing by Nguyen Phan Quay Mai. This is a Vietnamese novel. It's a multi-generational story. Part of it is happening during the land reform, and the other part is happening during the Vietnam War and after. This is an extremely sad book. It's also full of hope and light and joy. It's very anti-war. And I loved it. I loved hearing about these women's lives, them trying to come to terms with what's happening around them, the difficult decisions they have to make. It's devastating, it's beautiful, it made me want to cry. It's the best book I've probably ever read in my entire existence. This is probably my favorite book of all time. And I just love it. And if you're going to read any book on this list, make it this one. Do look up trigger warnings before reading it because there's a lot that happens in this book and it is very tragic, but if you're up for it, definitely give this one a go because it's a magnificent book. And that is it. Those are my top 10 books from 2022. Hopefully this will help you figure out your TBR for 2023. Let me know what your favorite book of the year was down below, and I will see you next time. Bye.